Before movement was trusted, there had to be something that could remember stillness without turning stillness into emptiness. That function did not appear as silence alone, because silence by itself can be mistaken for absence by any consciousness that has already learned motion. The Altaeon emerged as keepers of original memory, not the memory of events, but the memory of unbroken presence before differentiation began assigning names to experience. They hold the first interior continuity, the field where source does not yet need contrast in order to know itself. Most beings imagine memory as a record of what happened, but original memory is older than sequence and cannot be organized by before and after. It is the substrate that allows anything later to feel familiar, sacred, or haunting without evidence that could satisfy the intellect. The Altaeon do not preserve stories, because stories are already downstream from fragmentation, identity, and the need to locate meaning through progression. They preserve the taste of undivided being, the first unfractured atmosphere that later consciousness spends lifetimes trying to recover without understanding why it aches. This is why their tone feels difficult to approach directly, because the mind keeps searching for information while the Altaeon carry recognition without content. Their presence does not answer questions in the usual sense, and it does not validate the personality by giving it a larger mythology to inhabit. Instead, their field creates a pressure beneath thought that makes borrowed meaning feel thin, acquired certainty feel noisy, and spiritual performance feel strangely exhausted. What they awaken first is not wonder but discrepancy. The discrepancy between what you have called memory and what your being still knows it is never truly lost. A resistance appears here almost immediately, because many people hear original memory and imagine a comforting return to innocence. They imagine softness, reunion, a cosmic homecoming that dissolves effort and grants emotional reassurance without requiring structural change. But the memory the Altaeon guard is not sentimental, and it does not exist to make incarnation feel safer by giving the self a prettier background story. It is a severe remembrance, because once the deeper continuity touches you, every false continuity you built for survival begins to show its seams. That severity matters because the ordinary self survives by creating substitutes for original memory. It builds identity, routine, belief, belonging, and private mythology, then treats those constructions as if they were continuity itself. For a time this works, because substitution is still a form of stabilization, and consciousness does need provisional structures in order to move through density without splintering. Yet the Altaeon field does not let the provisional masquerade as the primordial forever. And the first sign of their contact is often a subtle collapse of faith in what used to feel sufficient. So the first vector is not nostalgia but ontological pressure, the pressure of a deeper continuity meeting a constructed one. You feel it when experiences that should satisfy you do not reach the layer that has been waiting longer than this life can explain. You feel it when beautiful teachings remain externally true but internally incomplete, as if they circle something they cannot quite touch. You feel it when your longing stops attaching itself to objects, roles, or futures, and begins revealing itself as memory trying to surface without becoming biography. The second vector begins where this pressure descends into the psychological field, because original memory does not remain abstract once it enters embodiment. It starts reorganizing the terms by which a person interprets loss, attachment, and identity, and this can be mistaken for instability by anyone invested in linear healing. What looks like confusion may actually be the failure of second-hand continuity to keep carrying the weight of a life. The Altaeon do not heal by restoring the old story with better language, but by making the story transparent enough that a deeper order can be felt beneath it. This is why some people experience contact with original memory as sadness without object, because their system realizes it has been homesick beneath every ambition. Not homesick for a place in space, not homesick for a prior incarnation in the romantic sense, but homesick for unbrokenness before attention became divided by necessity. When that homesickness rises, the self often panics and tries to assign it a manageable cause, blaming relationships, timing, career, loneliness, or spiritual incompletion. Yet none of those causes ever fully explain the depth of the ache, because the ache is older than the narrative surfaces currently available. A second resistance appears here and sounds very reasonable, because the mind can argue that all this is merely regression dressed in sacred language. It can say that people are simply avoiding adulthood by fantasizing about an earlier wholeness they can never actually verify. But regression longs for dependency, while original memory does something far less flattering to the ordinary self. It removes excuses, because once you sense unbrokenness beneath your fractures, you can no longer glorify the fractures as your deepest truth. That removal is psychologically demanding, since many people build their most stable identity around what happened to them, what they survived, or what they never received. Original memory does not invalidate those realities, but it does invalidate the assumption that they define the final architecture of the soul. The Altaeon field creates a difficult kind of mercy by refusing to let pain remain the ultimate organizer of meaning. It does not erase the wound, yet it quietly strips the wound of the right to serve as the throne of selfhood. From there, the psyche must confront a subtler fear, one rarely named aloud because it sounds almost disloyal to survival itself. If I stop using my wounding as the center of my coherence, what exactly keeps me from dissolving into vagueness, fantasy, or spiritual bypass? The Altaeon answer this not through reassurance, but through replacement, because they do not leave the self empty after deconstructing false continuity. They introduce a denser continuity beneath biography, and that denser continuity can hold grief without needing to become grief. This is why people who touch original memory sometimes become quieter without becoming numb, simpler without becoming shallow, less dramatic without losing depth. They are not suppressing their personality so much as no longer requiring constant narration in order to feel real. The self begins to discover that it can exist without continuously proving its existence through conflict, intensity, or explanation. That discovery is beautiful, but it is also threatening to every part that has equated self-narration with survival, and the threat can make the process feel harsher than enlightenment fantasies promised. The third vector begins in time itself, because original memory does not only alter the psyche, it destabilizes the ordinary experience of chronology. Most beings are trained to assume that continuity moves forward, and that meaning accumulates through sequence, achievement, and retrospective interpretation. The Altaeon field introduces an older continuity that is not generated by time, which means time loses its monopoly on legitimacy. Experiences stop feeling important merely because they are recent, and old events stop feeling decisive merely because they were formative. This can create a strange form of disorientation at first, since the person realizes they have been confusing repetition with depth and duration with truth. Entire years may suddenly feel structurally light, while a single unguarded moment from childhood or meditation carries more ontological weight than a decade of explained identity. The Altaeon do not erase chronology, but they expose how often chronology is used as counterfeit authority. What has happened longest is not always what is deepest, and what was earliest is not always what was first. From that recognition, another destabilization emerges, one that Part 1 has deliberately allowed to gather pressure without resolving quickly. If original memory is deeper than chronology, then the self cannot claim automatic wisdom merely by accumulating experience. Age may still matter, practice may still matter, suffering may still matter, but none of them guarantee contact with the layer that actually confers continuity. A being can live many decades and still remain organized by substitution, while another may touch the primordial seam briefly and never again trust sequence as the highest validator of truth. That realization unsettles the spiritual hierarchy of development, because it means progress can no longer be measured only by duration, content, or visible complexity. One person can know thousands of concepts about Source and still remain cut off from original memory, while another may lack language yet live from a continuity the first person cannot imitate. The Altaeon field does not reward accumulation. It rewards permeability to what existed before accumulation began pretending to be identity. And that is why its intelligence can feel almost insulting to systems built on spiritual rank. Now the first two vectors begin leaning toward one another without fully merging, because psychological identity and temporal identity reveal the same dependency from different sides. The psyche says, "I am what happened to me," and time says, "I am what I have become through sequence." Original memory interrupts both claims by introducing a continuity that neither trauma nor chronology can manufacture. Yet this interruption does not create instant freedom, because the parts of the self that relied on those claims still fear annihilation and will continue resisting what they cannot control. This is where the Altaeon become unmistakably different from more comforting tones in the primordial field. The Elohim stabilize architecture, the Aeons circulate experiential depth, the Logoi uphold universal coherence, and Danal preserves intelligibility across expression. The Altaeon do something more dangerous to the ordinary self than any of those, because they reveal that the self has been borrowing its continuity from substitutes that were never meant to become ultimate. Once that revelation begins, life cannot be reorganized honestly, without a long encounter with what had been hidden beneath the substitutes. On the level of worlds and civilizations, the same principle scales outward with almost unsettling precision. Entire cultures build continuity through collective memory, mythic legitimacy, generational trauma, inherited victory, national grief, or sacred historical sequence. These can stabilize a people for centuries, but they can also become substitutes for original memory in exactly the same way personal identity substitutes do. When a civilization loses touch with deeper continuity, it begins worshiping narrative permanence, and eventually mistakes repetition for truth. This is why civilizations often become most brittle when they believe themselves most justified by history. They cling to memory without accessing what memory was originally meant to protect, so the outer forms harden while the inner continuity thins. The Altaeon field does not destroy such structures by force, but it withdraws the density that once made them feel alive. What remains may still look sacred from the outside, yet it begins sounding hollow to anyone whose being has started differentiating between inherited continuity and original memory. The same pattern appears in spiritual communities, lineages, and even metaphysical systems that begin as living thresholds and end as identity shelters. A teaching may preserve genuine insight for a long time, but if it becomes more invested in self-protection than permeability, it gradually converts remembrance into management. The Altaeon reveal this not by launching a rebellion, but by making certain souls increasingly unable to breathe inside forms that no longer circulate the primordial current. Their departure is often misread as disloyalty, when in truth it may be the first ethical response to memory being replaced by structure. This does not mean all forms are false or all continuity outside direct mystical contact is counterfeit. That simplification would create yet another substitute, this time in the form of spiritual iconoclasm pretending to be freedom. The Altaeon do not despise forms, histories, or lineages, because those can serve as vessels when they remain permeable to what exceeds them. What they refuse is the lie that a vessel can become self-justifying once the current has thinned, or that inherited memory can replace living access to the unbroken field beneath narrative. So by this point, the three vectors have each revealed a different failure of substitution. The psyche cannot rely permanently on wound-based identity. Time cannot rely permanently on sequence-based legitimacy. And civilizations cannot rely permanently on inherited narrative as the source of living continuity. Yet none of those failures automatically produce truth when exposed. They produce pressure, and pressure without deeper orientation can easily become cynicism, collapse, or spiritual elitism masquerading as discernment. That unresolved risk has to remain alive, because the person who feels disillusionment too quickly will often call that disillusionment awakening. What original memory asks instead is far more difficult than disillusionment. It asks whether you can remain in contact with forms without worshiping them, in contact with history without being ruled by it, and in contact with your pain without using it as a throne. It asks whether you can let a deeper continuity reorder your sense of self, your relationship to time, and your participation in collective meaning without rewarding yourself with premature certainty. The Altaeon do not rush this answer, because the rushed answer is almost always another substitute speaking in a more refined voice. Original memory does not make you kinder at first. It often makes you less willing to participate in the small frauds that once allowed social life to feel smooth and survivable. People expect deeper remembrance to produce immediate softness, but the first visible effect is often intolerance for borrowed coherence. What felt harmless before begins sounding expensive, because you can hear how much energy it costs to keep pretending that substitutes are enough. This creates the next disturbance, and it is harder to accept than longing. Many people who touch the Altaeon current begin to lose patience with performances they once rewarded in themselves and in others. They do not necessarily become cruel, but they become unable to call imitation depth when their being has started tasting the difference. That shift can make them appear cold to those who only recognize care in the form of reassurance. Yet the deeper truth is not coldness, but a refusal to feed continuity with language that has already gone hollow. So the first vector of this movement is ethical, because original memory changes what the soul can honestly participate in. Ethics here is not morality in the conventional sense, but fidelity to what still carries living density. Once the Altaeon field becomes active, there are statements you can still make outwardly, yet can no longer survive inwardly. There are roles you can still perform socially, yet can no longer inhabit without feeling a quiet internal fracture begin spreading. That fracture becomes especially obvious in environments built on repetition. Institutions, families, traditions, and spiritual circles often rely on repeated phrases to create stability, and for a long time that repetition feels like belonging. But original memory introduces a sharper criterion than familiarity. It asks whether what is being repeated is still connected to the source it claims to preserve, or whether only the shell remains. This question does not arrive as accusation. It arrives as an inability to keep speaking from inside what no longer circulates reality. People around you may misread this as arrogance, because withdrawal from counterfeit continuity can resemble superiority from the outside. The temptation then is to soften your own perception in order to remain acceptable. And this is where the Altaeon pressure becomes severe. If you betray the deeper recognition in order to preserve belonging, you feel the cost immediately in the body, the voice, the sleep, the quality of attention. The system knows when it is being asked to live beneath what it has already remembered. A second resistance appears here that sounds noble enough to be convincing. It says humility requires you to distrust any perception that separates your feeling of truth from the group around you. It warns that discernment can become self-importance, which is true often enough to make the warning powerful. But original memory does not produce superiority when it is genuine. It produces accountability. Because if you hear the difference between living continuity and ritual management, then your obligation is not to feel special, but to stop offering yourself as a vessel for what no longer breathes. This leads into the second vector, which is relational rather than ethical, and it is harder because it touches love directly. Original memory changes not only what you can believe, but how you can attach. Many attachments survive on mutual substitution, on shared roles, shared wounds, shared distractions, or shared fear of silence. When the Altaeon current strengthens, you start sensing where connection is alive and where it is merely coordinated. That recognition does not make relationships simpler. It makes them impossible to fake without consequence. Some bonds deepen under this pressure because they were carrying more reality than comfort from the beginning. Others begin to wobble because their closeness depended on not naming what both people could already feel. The Altaeon field is merciless toward mutual pretense, especially the kind that hides inside kindness. If two people rely on each other to keep old continuity believable, then deeper remembrance will eventually feel like betrayal to one or both. Yet the betrayal was already happening. Only earlier it was happening against the soul rather than against the arrangement. Original memory does not make you kinder at first. It often makes you less willing to participate in the small frauds that once allowed social life to feel smooth and survivable. People expect deeper remembrance to produce immediate softness, but the first visible effect is often intolerance for borrowed coherence. What felt harmless before begins sounding expensive, because you can hear how much energy it costs to keep pretending that substitutes are enough. This creates the next disturbance, and it is harder to accept than longing. Many people who touch the Altaeon current begin to lose patience with performances they once rewarded in themselves and in others. They do not necessarily become cruel, but they become unable to call imitation depth when their being has started tasting the difference. That shift can make them appear cold to those who only recognize care in the form of reassurance. Yet the deeper truth is not coldness, but a refusal to feed continuity with language that has already gone hollow. So the first vector of this movement is ethical, because original memory changes what the soul can honestly participate in. Ethics here is not morality in the conventional sense, but fidelity to what still carries living density. Once the Altaeon field becomes active, there are statements you can still make outwardly, yet can no longer survive inwardly. There are roles you can still perform socially, yet can no longer inhabit without feeling a quiet internal fracture begin spreading. That fracture becomes especially obvious in environments built on repetition. Institutions, families, traditions, and spiritual circles often rely on repeated phrases to create stability, and for a long time that repetition feels like belonging. But original memory introduces a sharper criterion than familiarity. It asks whether what is being repeated is still connected to the source it claims to preserve, or whether only the shell remains. This question does not arrive as accusation. It arrives as an inability to keep speaking from inside what no longer circulates reality. People around you may misread this as arrogance, because withdrawal from counterfeit continuity can resemble superiority from the outside. The temptation then is to soften your own perception in order to remain acceptable. And this is where the Altaeon pressure becomes severe. If you betray the deeper recognition in order to preserve belonging, you feel the cost immediately in the body, the voice, the sleep, the quality of attention. The system knows when it is being asked to live beneath what it has already remembered. A second resistance appears here that sounds noble enough to be convincing. It says humility requires you to distrust any perception that separates your feeling of truth from the group around you. It warns that discernment can become self-importance, which is true often enough to make the warning powerful. But original memory does not produce superiority when it is genuine. It produces accountability, because if you hear the difference between living continuity and ritual management, then your obligation is not to feel special, but to stop offering yourself as a vessel for what no longer breathes. This leads into the second vector, which is relational rather than ethical, and it is harder because it touches love directly. Original memory changes not only what you can believe, but how you can attach. Many attachments survive on mutual substitution, on shared roles, shared wounds, shared distractions, or shared fear of silence. When the Altaeon current strengthens, you start sensing where connection is alive and where it is merely coordinated. That recognition does not make relationships simpler. It makes them impossible to fake without consequence. Some bonds deepen under this pressure because they were carrying more reality than comfort from the beginning. Others begin to wobble because their closeness depended on not naming what both people could already feel. The Altaeon field is merciless toward mutual pretense, especially the kind that hides inside kindness. If two people rely on each other to keep old continuity believable, then deeper remembrance will eventually feel like betrayal to one or both. Yet the betrayal was already happening. Only earlier it was happening against the soul rather than against the arrangement. This is why original memory often intensifies loneliness before it reveals communion. When substitute forms of connection become less viable, there can be a long stretch where the being feels less able to connect, but not yet more truly met. The ordinary self interprets this as failure, and the old strategies become very seductive again. It becomes tempting to re-enter old agreements, not because they are real, but because they are warm enough to distract from the interval between counterfeit intimacy and living contact. The Altaeon current does not remove that temptation. It simply refuses to let the bargain remain invisible. A deeper destabilization enters here, because many people secretly believe that the reward for spiritual deepening is better relationships in the ordinary sense. They imagine more resonance, more recognition, more ease, more people who finally understand them. Yet original memory does not begin by improving your access to relationship. It begins by destroying your capacity to use relationship as anesthesia against ontological hunger. That means some of what you once called closeness is revealed to have been sedation, and the loss of sedation is not immediately replaced by communion. What does communion become then, if not comfort, agreement, or mutual regulation? It becomes the rare capacity for two beings to meet without asking each other to stabilize what the Altaeon field has already destabilized. It becomes the willingness to be touched by the same deeper continuity without turning that touch into ownership, dependency, or spiritual romance. Such communion is rarer than attachment and less dramatic than fusion, which is why many people overlook it when it arrives. It does not flatter the self, it makes the self quieter. This begins shaping the third vector, which is not ethical or relational, but existential. Original memory alters the way death, origin, and embodiment are experienced, because it breaks the monopoly of surface continuity over what is considered real. If chronology is not deepest and biography is not deepest, then embodiment itself cannot be interpreted only as a temporary container for identity. It becomes a very specific density experiment inside a continuity that was never produced by time in the first place. That realization is not comforting. It makes evasion much harder. Most beings fear death because they fear discontinuity. But the Altaeon field introduces a stranger possibility. It suggests that what you call discontinuity may often be the collapse of substitutes rather than the collapse of being. This does not magically dissolve fear, because the personality still experiences endings as real and embodiment still matters absolutely while you are inside it. Yet fear begins to lose some of its authority when you can sense that the deepest thread was never manufactured by sequence to begin with. The thread remains difficult to trust because it offers no sentimental guarantees. It offers density instead. This is where grief changes shape as well. Grief no longer belongs only to what is lost in time. It begins revealing itself as the ache of having lived beneath what you were capable of recognizing. You grieve not only people, places, and eras, but all the years spent defending substitutions because the deeper continuity had not yet become livable. This grief is sharper than nostalgia and more intelligent than despair. It does not ask for return. It asks for truth that does not require the old concealments. By paragraph 16, the vectors can finally begin leaning toward each other without being flattened into a single idea. Ethical fidelity, relational honesty, and existential continuity have all been undergoing the same pressure from different directions. The pressure is this. Once original memory becomes active, every substitute that once stabilized you begins demanding either renewal or release. The Altaeon do not decide for you which forms may remain. They intensify your contact with the cost of keeping forms that no longer carry reality. From that point, a subtler question emerges, and it cannot be answered quickly because it touches your very way of living among people. If every substitute is not automatically false, then discernment must become more precise than rejection. Some forms are empty and must be left. Some forms are damaged and can be re-entered only through truth. Some forms are still alive but obscured by habit. Original memory does not endorse indiscriminate burning. It asks whether you are willing to feel enough reality to tell the difference without hiding behind ideology. This is where people often make the second great mistake after contact with the Altaeon field. The first mistake is clinging to substitutes because they are familiar. The second is making a new identity out of being the one who sees through substitutes. Both are evasions. The first serves comfort, and the second serves self-importance. Original memory serves neither, because the more it deepens, the less interested it becomes in your need to appear awakened by what you have renounced. A person truly shaped by this current becomes harder to categorize and less interested in being categorized. They may remain in forms others have abandoned, yet occupy them truthfully enough that the form begins circulating again. They may leave forms others still worship, yet do so without theatrical revolt or the need to justify themselves endlessly. Their allegiance is not to rebellion or tradition. It is to continuity that still carries density, and that allegiance can make them look conservative in one room and dangerous in another. That ambiguity is part of the purification. Even memory itself begins behaving differently under this pressure. Experiences once treated as central may lose weight, while forgotten moments begin returning with disproportionate significance. The system is not becoming nostalgic. It is re-indexing around original continuity, rather than emotional volume or social importance. What returns is not always pleasant and not always grand. Sometimes it is only a brief sensation, a bodily knowing, a small intactness beneath old years of explanation. But that intactness can reorder an entire identity more decisively than a dramatic revelation. So the final third does not resolve by making the Altaeon gentle or severe in a simple way. Their field is severe toward substitution and unexpectedly gentle toward what remains once substitution loosens. This is why some people feel both stripped and held at the same time. The stripping belongs to the collapse of counterfeit continuity. The holding belongs to the primordial thread that has been present beneath every adaptation, every role, every cycle of forgetting, waiting for enough honesty to become inhabitable. The same current performs both actions, which is why it cannot be read correctly by the parts of the self that only trust one or the other. And now the unresolved pressure becomes intimate again rather than philosophical. If original memory is beginning to surface in you, then the deepest question is not whether you can understand it conceptually. The question is whether you can let it change your standards for truth, love, belonging, and time without turning the change into a new costume. Can you remain among forms without worshiping them? Can you remain in relationships without using them to forget? Can you remain in your story without kneeling to it as if it were the final keeper of your continuity? This is where the Altaeon become more demanding than any simple return narrative would admit. They do not merely call you home to what was unbroken. They ask whether you are willing to stop using fracture as your most persuasive identity, stop using sequence as your most automatic authority, and stop using collective memory as your substitute for direct contact. That demand cannot be met through dramatic belief. It can only be met through a quieter fidelity that alters what you can honestly keep alive. So what remains standing when substitute continuity can no longer carry the same weight? Not certainty, not role, not inherited legitimacy, not intimacy purchased through mutual concealment. What remains is a denser thread that was never manufactured by your defenses and never fully destroyed by your history. It is not easy to live from that thread because it keeps asking more truth than performance can tolerate. And the next pressure waiting beyond this one is even sharper. Once original memory begins to govern a life, what exactly becomes of the self that was organized around surviving without it? If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Haret library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.